Hello everyone and welcome to the third video in this chess strategy series. And today's video is titled "A Knight on the Rim is Dim." Now, why is that a good saying to remember when it comes to chess strategy? Well, let's find out. Today I have a game review of a game that I played earlier this week at a local chess club. So I have the white pieces playing against my opponent, Vinny, with the black pieces. And so I used the hippopotamus defense to begin with, where you just fianchetto both bishops. And my opponent, he tries to copy and do the same. So the reason to fianchetto the bishops is that it allows those bishops to attack through the center of the board all the way to your opponent's king side here with this bishop, and the same with the other bishop. They just fire up through the center and control a lot of space. So we continue developing here. He's ready to castle, and in the hippo defense, normally white will fianchetto both bishops, bring his center pawns up one square instead of two, and then put the knights in behind them. Whereas my opponent has put the knights on squares that are probably a little bit better in general. When it comes to chess strategy, you want to push your knights towards the center of the board. And why are knights on the rim dim? Well, they just control less squares there. So already, if we look at my two knights, they can only go to 3 different squares here, or they cover 3 different squares, I should say. They can't jump into D2 and E2 yet because there are pawns in the way, but you get the picture. So the knights control 3 squares on the edge, or even if they're in the corner, they can only control 2 squares. Where these knights, once they move out towards the center, now we see black's knights are attacking 8 possible squares each. So the more squares that your knights can attack, the more influence they'll have. And so it's better to keep them in the center of the board as opposed to the edge. So moving on, I start developing in the normal hippo defense manner here, which the hippo defense, these aren't the best moves to be played in the opening, but I just wanted to try something different. We didn't play with a clock or anything, so it was just a friendly game, but it was kind of instructive. We'll see what we can learn here. So I continue with my development. He fianchettos both of his bishops, and then I bring my knights in here to the second rank. And from here, these knights can support the F and C pawns jumping forward, or I could push the H pawn and the A pawn up one square, and then push the B pawn and the G pawn up to G4 or B4, and then the knights can jump in behind those B and G pawns. That's just options. So this hippo defense is kind of flexible, but it is a little more complicated. I wouldn't recommend it to be your main opening, especially if you're a beginner or starting out in chess, but it could be something fun just to try and see what you think. All right, so my opponent does, as far as chess strategy, make a good move here. This is the best move. If your opponent does not fight for the center of the board by jumping his pawns 2 squares forward, then you might as well go ahead and do that. And my opponent does. He takes advantage while I'm just moving these pawns off on the edge here. He goes ahead and takes control of the center. So right now, if we look at the evaluation, black is slightly ahead here. He's controlling the center better than I am because his knights are pushed forward here to f6 and c6, where they control more of the center. His pawns give him more space. So strategically, my opponent is playing better moves here. So we continue on. I just play the normal hippo defense setup, which is what we have right now. The pawns here preventing my opponent's pieces from jumping forward. And it's kind of a waiting system defense where you just set up this system of pieces in certain squares the way they are here, and then you kind of just wait to see what your opponent's doing, and then make your moves based on that. So now we have e4. So finally my opponent decides to try and push even further forward and gain some space here. So was this premature? Perhaps. It looks like the computer prefers a queen move. Although, here it says e4 is about the same as, after the move is made. Now the computer recommends queen to d7, which gets the rooks connected and gives them more room to move along the back rank and possibly move this rook on a8 over here to d8, because strategy wise, when it comes to rooks, you want to move them to squares where you have your pawns pushed forward in front of the rooks, or a half open or open file. But since we don't have any of that yet, probably d8 and e8 would be the best squares for the rooks. Alright, so I push forward here to lock up the center, which gives me more time to figure out what I'm going to do before we break things open. And my opponent just kind of plays a passive move. I guess he played this because he wanted to push forward with his b pawn and have it protected. Although he probably could have just immediately pushed that b pawn forward. All right, so now we have c4 being played. So a good strategy is to try and trade off one of your pawns on the side for one of your opponent's center pawns, because the center pawns, when it comes to pawns, they're usually your most valuable pawns, because the center is very important in chess. Whoever controls the center will probably influence the game to a greater degree, because a lot happens in the center. And if you control the center, it allows you to move your pieces through the center without your opponent being able to stop you. And then from the center, your pieces can easily move to other areas of the board, wherever you need to put them to either attack the king side or attack the queen side. So I'm trying to just trade off this less valuable pawn for his more valuable central pawn, and then possibly weaken this e pawn that he's pushed forward, especially if I knock off this defender here on d5. So my opponent plays b5, and the computer says this is a mistake, and now the game jumps from negative a little bit, maybe 0.33 in black's favor, to +1, over a pawn's worth of material to white's advantage here. So it looks like the computer, instead of that b5 move, preferred the knight move here, which does a few things. It unblocks this c pawn, but it also defends this pawn in the center here. So if this pawn captures, the knight could recapture. And so the computer recommends white captures, and then the knight jump back in towards the center here, capturing. And this is one possible way the game could have played out, and it's what the computer recommends. But with this, variation, it looks like black would keep a slight edge in the game. All right, so if we go back to see what actually happened in the game, after c4, a mistake was made, b5, and so here I capture in the center, which the computer says is a great move. I don't know how great it was. It was kind of an obvious move if I pushed up to c4, and attacked and captured this central pawn for my less valuable pawn. And now my opponent makes another an inaccuracy here. Once again, the computer preferred the knight jumping up here and attacking the pawn instead of capturing with the queen, because now the queen can be a target here in the center. So another piece of strategy that you want to watch out for is be careful of bringing your queen out too far into the center of the board where it can become a target and be attacked, because now I'm able to reposition my knight to a better square up closer towards the center, attacking this weakened e-pawn here. Now the queen has to waste time running away, and it looks like the best move would have been for the queen to retreat to d8 here, but instead my opponent makes another inaccuracy, moving to the edge of the board, perhaps wanting to try and put pressure on my king side, but also attacking my queen. So maybe he just wanted to trade down material. But, if we look at the position, I'm ahead a pawn now. Not quite yet. I kind of got ahead of myself. I will be ahead a pawn after I capture this e-pawn, because now I have a bishop and two knights piling up on this e-pawn. And the computer preferred the queen to just retreat to d8. But now that he's moved to h5 here, I take the opportunity to capture here. And I figured that my opponent wouldn't want to break up his kingside pawns and that he would capture with the knight. And the computer, in fact, prefers capturing with the g-pawn, which would break apart the kingside pawns and weaken these pawns around the black king. But maybe it would also leave an opening for rooks to attack down towards my kingside. But I suspected that my opponent would play the second best move, which was to capture with the knight, and that's what he did. So now we have a knight on the rim here, which we'll see why knights on the rim are dim. From here, this knight is very limited. It can't go back to g7, of course, because the bishop's there. It can't go capture this pawn or move to f4. So really the only square left is for that knight to just jump back where it was. But in the game, it's my turn now, and now I have three pieces attacking this pawn, and there's only one defender. So of course I snatch up the pawn, and it says that this was an excellent move, but a little better would have been to capture with the other knight, because now that I've moved this knight, which was protecting the b pawn, it gives my opponent some time to attack here, which the computer says is an excellent move, although it preferred the knight to retreat to the rim. And now there are instances where it might be okay to move your knight to the edge of the board, but that's usually when you move it there to reposition it back off the edge of the board and back towards the center. So, by moving that knight here to d8, it could have repositioned, maybe to e6 here. But anyway, the knight moves to the edge of the board. So now black has two knights on the rim. So if we take a look at this, just the development of both pieces, both sides. Look at the difference between white's knights and black's. So each of my knights attack 8 different squares apiece, whereas his only attack 1, 2, 3, 4, and so they only attack 4 squares. So he's cut the power of his knights in half, or even more, because they're all the way on the edge of the board, and mine are in the center, where they can easily jump to wherever I need them to go a lot more easily than these knights on the edge. And also, knights and bishops are different in that knights are slower. So if you have the knights on the edge of the board, and let's say some action starts to take place on the other side of the board, it's going to take you, at least 1, 2, 3 moves to get to the other side of the board with those knights. And so you have to keep that in mind, and that's why it's another reason to put the knights in the center of the board. They can get to where they need to go more quickly. All right, so here knight to d2 was played, and this was an inaccuracy according to the computer. So white is still ahead by plus 1.8, but if I would have played g4, that would have kept white ahead by plus 2.8. So, what could have happened if I played this g4 move? Well, there are different options here. The knight could have just retreated, and then because black is behind in material, it would have been better for, after this knight retreats to f6, to just capture and force a recapture because the king is checked, and then it could give you time to pick off this other bishop and just trade material down. So that's one option. And it looks like the computer prefers that knight retreat to f6, but also a counterattack with f5 could possibly be played, attacking this knight here. And then the other option is for this knight here to capture on b3, attacking the rook on a1. But then the computer just recommends capturing on h5, and then if my rook is captured on a1, to just recapture. So you'd give up basically your 2 knights, or black would have given up 2 knights for a rook if he captures here on b3. But in the game, I did not play that g4 move. So after knight to a5, I just retreat my knight back here and cover this pawn. And this kind of just keeps the knight on the edge of the board. Now he can't capture the pawn. His only option is to jump back to c6 and block in his backwards c7 pawn. All right, so moving forward, now we have bishop captures, and it looks like instead, if we go back one before we take a look at the rest of this, the computer says this is an inaccuracy. And a better move, and this move would have been harder to see, but it looks like a better move would have been, to capture with the knight instead. So getting this knight that was on the rim looking very dim and jumping back into the action, giving up this knight. So after a capture, then the rook can jump in here. So basically you give up your knight for 2 pawns. And the computer says that's the best way to go. But for us normal people, it may be a little harder to see those kind of moves and figure out if that was best or not, because you are giving up a knight for 2 pawns, even though you've broken up the center here. And the computer recommends capture. Now, the rook cannot immediately capture this pawn on g3 because then the bishop could just move back and save itself and block the check. So black would have to capture with the knight. And now the knight, it's not as dim because it's not on the rim, but still it's way back here in the corner. And this is not a great square either. So, white could continue by blocking the path of the rook, and then black would double rooks on an open file. That's almost always a good strategy whenever you can double your rooks and take control of an open file like this. And then the computer recommends just moving the rook here to a half open file so that possibly in the future the knight could move out of the way and this pawn would be under attack. So anyway, this is what the computer recommends. But instead of capturing here and giving up the knight for some pawns, bishop to g2 was played. So the bishop shoots down the board, exchanging off my light squared bishop for his. And normally you want to do that to create weaknesses around the king when it's a fianchettoed position and you can knock out the bishop. But we've already traded off queens and it's a little harder to get at the king without the queen to jump in here and harass the king. So anyway, moving on. The rook moves to the center. So if there are half open files, remember, it's almost always to place your rooks on open or half open files. Here, they're targeting these pawns to try and slow them down from pushing forward. But I move on here with b4. And so maybe I shouldn't have chased the knight from the rim back into the center of the board. But, the computer says this is an excellent move and a4 would have been better. But my reasoning behind this move is I wanted to secure this c5 square as an outpost for my knight. So one of the best ways to improve the scope of your knight is to place them on an outpost square. As you'll see here, c5, where it cannot be chased away by a pawn because these pawns have moved forward and there's no pawn on the d file. So this is a great outpost for the knight. So my opponent has to retreat. I jump up here, preparing to jump up to c5, and also maybe keep an eye on this a pawn to prevent it from pushing forward. So we have knight to e7. And the computer says that's an excellent move, although it prefers a pawn push here. So another piece of strategy is when you're behind in material, and I've mentioned this before. So if we look at this position, I'm ahead by one pawn. Now my goal should be to trade off pieces and then use my extra pawn in the endgame to promote it. And my opponent should avoid exchanges, but try and trade off all the pawns, or as many pawns as he can, because then if I just had one extra pawn in the endgame, he could possibly just capture it with a piece, and if the game went down to where I just had like a knight or a bishop and an extra pawn, and my opponent just captures that pawn with the piece, well then I just have that knight or bishop and a king, and you cannot checkmate your opponent with that, and it would be a draw. Okay, so moving on, I jump up here and take this outpost. So now, look again at my knights. They're in the center here, controlling a lot of squares. This knight is looking pitiful over here on the edge, not doing much. The only place it can go is to jump back here to f6. and then try and exert some influence on the center, maybe at d5. And this knight here is back on the second rank. Sure, it's controlling d4 or helping control that square, keeping my knight out along with the rook. So the game continues with rook to d6, protecting the pawn which I'm attacking here. Now, the computer gives knight to f5 as being the best move. I guess just letting that pawn be captured. But, once again, those moves are kind of hard to see. For people, the computer finds things that an average person may have difficulty seeing. All right, so here I wasn't sure what to do. It looks like moving to d1 behind this pawn that is pushed forward would have been best. But here I thought I was going to start pushing my pawns on the queen side, and also the rook here can protect this bishop if I open the center up. So, moving on. Now, my opponent tries to jump in here and take control of this c file. But, for the moment, my knight on this great outpost is blocking his path. And so continuing on, we have a4. I decide to try and attack the b pawn because my knight is attacking it as well. So my opponent moves to b8 to help defend. And now I capture, opening up this a file here for my rook. After the recapture, well, now I play rook to a5, but it looks like the computer prefers d5 here, just immediately attacking the rook. But, the game continues here with rook to a5, putting more pressure on this pawn. And now my opponent makes an inaccuracy, which jumps the game in white's favor, plus 5.6 here. So, here white is basically winning now. So I played rook at b to a1 just to double up my rooks. But it looks like I should have immediately instead just checked the king over here. So instead of that move, I should have just brought the rook up. Excuse me, I have to take that move back. So it's saying I should have just checked immediately. So now, if I would have done that, what is the option? The king, would probably block with the bishop. But now, what is possible? Do I try and jump my knight up here and then put more pressure on this pinned bishop, with the knight and the rook? And at the same time, I would be forking the bishop and the rook over here, so that's a possible option. And the computer says that's the third best move. It looks like the best move, once again, is to attack here. Jump the pawn up to d5 and attack the rook. So anyway, we'll finish this up here once again before the video gets too long. So I just decided to double up my rooks, which was still a good move. And now my opponent makes, the final losing move here. Putting, once again, a knight on the rim. And, just take a look at this knight. This is a very dim knight. So, basically, this knight, can't move anywhere except back to either d6 or e3. But by placing the knight here, it gives me the option to pin that knight to the king. So my opponent overlooked king safety and piece safety at the same time. Because now I just played rook to a8, pinning the knight. And there's no way to protect this knight. So we played on a little bit further, but this very dim knight here is snatched up. But first, my opponent, he realized he was in trouble and he makes a desperate move, which was not the best. It looked like best would have been just to push his h-pawn to make a little escape hole for the king. He would still lose his knight, but now he's going to lose a bishop and the knight. So I capture. The game continues with the king moving out of this pin, unpinning the knight. But now I just capture the knight, and so I'm ahead by +8, almost +9 here. And so we played a few more moves. The king, I don't know, jumps down here. I'm not sure what he was trying to do, but now I activate this bishop, which was doing nothing for the whole game. So now it moves on this open diagonal with check. The king blocks with the pawn, but now I jump this knight up to the center. And so this is another strategy. If you have a knight on an outpost, like this knight on c5, well then a lot of times it's good to put the other knight where it can back that knight up. Now here, possibly this f-pawn at some point could attack the knight and drive it away. But here I could just capture this g-pawn because now the bishop and knight are piling up on this g-pawn. So, if this knight on the e4 square was at b3 or d3, it would do a good job of fortifying this knight. But here I'm attacking. So my opponent moves forward, fortifying this g-pawn. But now I play d5, attacking his rook, which is trapped here. So, what does he do? He can't move this rook or it'll be captured by the knight, which would be his best option, is just to move the rook here to d6, where my knight would capture and then he could recapture with a pawn. But in the game, my opponent at this point, was having trouble and was feeling the pressure, and so he just moves here and then he resigned because he realized probably that by moving here, now the game could have played out with capture by my rook. If he recaptures, well then my knight captures, and now he's left with this dim knight on the rim, and I just have extra pieces, and it would really be losing then. So the game could have continued with maybe an attack there, capture. This is just something the computer says is how the game could have continued. But you get the idea. So today's lesson was to always be mindful of where you place your knights. So you definitely don't want them stuck on the edge of the board because a knight on the rim can definitely be dim. And if you do put it on the edge of the board, try and maneuver it back out towards the center. So if we just take a look here, a few moves in, let's see. So back in the beginning, just as a review, here we also see that the queen came out too early, allowing me to attack and better position my knights. So now this knight, which was on the second rank, jumps up here to c3, where it's controlling the middle more. And then here, my opponent, I guess he was trying to trade off queens, but I was about to snatch up this other pawn, and so then it would be good to trade off material. So I trade off, and now the first knight is on the rim, very dim, and the knight ended up staying here, for the rest of the game. And we saw that, that was like playing one piece down when you have a knight, so far on the edge doing nothing over there. So now my knight jumps into the center, but now the other knight goes to this edge over on the rim here. Now he is attacking, so it did force me to decide what to do about that. And I guess I could have just pushed my pawn forward, attacking him, but that could have given him an outpost here on c4. So I didn't want to do that, so I retreat back. And now trading off more material really just kind of helps me because I'm ahead by that extra pawn. So now I chase him away, knowing that if he moves here now, I can capture, and he'll have weakened all his queenside pawns and have doubled pawns there, which would be targets. So he doesn't want to break his pawns apart. He retreats. But by now, my knights are just better positioned than his. So, avoid knights on the rim where they can be very dim. I hope this chess strategy video helped you out. And if you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe if you haven't already. And once again, feel free to leave comments or suggestions. And also, any chess video requests, and I will try and do a video for what you request. All right. Well, have a good day, everyone, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.